On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 16, Monotheism and Polytheism. Biblical monotheism was born of a schism. It was engendered by the separation and denial of the civilization predominant around 1800 BC and Yor by a group of nomadic tribes that oral tradition places under Abraham's leadership. From this separation, from this dissidence, the beginning of a new creed would be fashioned, characterized by a radical break, dualist monotheism. This creed distinguished, it seems, Israel from all other peoples of the world. As shown by the ceaseless war waged against Canaanite and Moabite forms of worship, dualist monotheism was the specific property of the Hebrews. Contrary to Renan's claim, Arabia has always been the boulevard of monotheism. The Near East during the second millennium before Christ in no way displayed any general tendency toward monotheism. No trace of it is to be found among the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, the pre-Islamic Arabs, or the Syrians. Even the religion of Aten, the Egyptian solar disk, that has prompted so many familiar commentaries, notably Freud's, is not a dualistic monotheism, but rather the end result of a process begun during the reign of Thutmose IV, which allowed the pharaoh to free himself of the Theban clergy's tutelage. Jewish tradition postulates an original monotheism that gradually disappeared because of man's sins. It is this idea of an earlier monotheism that provides the basis for the Bible's prohibition of idolatry for the entire human race. Specialists of the 18th and 19th centuries long argued over whether this theory had some basis in reality, whether the gods of paganism resulted from some sort of decadence and a decline in religious feeling, or if, on the contrary, humanity had gradually evolved from polytheism to monotheism. This discussion, somewhat irrelevant today, in fact presents two equally false theories, to the extent that both postulate a gradual unilinear evolution for all humanity. In reality, the monotheist/polytheist relationship is not a diachronic, chronological one, but rather the relationship of two different mentalities. Yahweh is neither the fallen father nor the culmination or survivor of mythic gods. Furthermore, the term God, which emerged from European paganism, is an imperfect label. It was the Septuagint which, in order to be understood by Greeks and Hellenized Jews, gave the deity of Sinai, YHWH, Yahweh, Elohim, the name Theos/Deus, which up to that time strictly speaking designated only the gods of paganism. Although perfectly original, biblical monotheism was not formed in a day. Alfred Loisy said, Yahweh is only God of Israel since, or if preferable, because of the Exodus? Biblical monotheism does not in fact constitute a finished system until the prophecies of the exile era. It is far from displaying this character during the time of the patriarchs and Moses. The first literary collections of the Bible themselves only date from 1000 BC, in other words from the time of the establishment of kingship among the Hebrews. The Jehovah's document of Judean origin would have been written toward the end of the 10th century under Solomon. The Elohist, or sacerdotal, document would have been written around 800 to 750 BC. The fusion of the two narratives would have taken place during the time of the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. Contrary to Renan, the Hebrews had a mythology, which they apparently had great trouble undoing. These polytheistic remnants are especially visible in the Jehovah's narrative. Genesis itself opens with a plural, evavis, and many of its elements appear to have been borrowed from the mythologies and cosmogonies of the Near East, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Akkadian tales, and so on. One might see traces of ancient deities in the cherubim, kruvim, a word derived from the Akkadian caribou, intercessor, and the seraphim who the Bible says guarded the Garden of Eden and held up the Lord's throne in Ezekiel's vision, among other things. These would be deities that may have originated in the beliefs of surrounding peoples. Left to themselves, the Hebrews depicted the deity in the form of a calf, Exodus 32:4, 1 Kings 12:28, no doubt under the influence of certain fertility cults. The fundamental monotheist assertion is contained in Exodus when Yahweh tells Moses, "You will not bow down before another god, for I am a jealous God. Do not form alliances with the inhabitants of other countries, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and offer them sacrifices, they will invite you and you will eat of their sacrifice. You will take their daughters for your sons, their daughters prostitute themselves to their gods and will prostitute your sons to their gods." 34:14-16. With respect to Yahweh's jealousy, Nietzsche observed, people think themselves disinterested in love because they crave the advantage of another being, often against their own advantage. But this being in exchange wants to possess them. Even God is no exception here. He becomes terrible when his love is not returned. However, while this passage confirms the unique nature of Yahweh, it does not assert the non-existence of other gods. This is the reason why many authors, when referring to Moses, prefer to speak of effective monotheism or monolatry. Yahwehism before the conquest of Canaan, writes Raphael Pertai, is a sort of monolatry, tending toward ethnic monotheism. The famous verse from Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is the sole Yahweh," 6-4, which today constitutes the beginning of the schema, is interpreted by some to mean, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone." This formulation, in other words, does not radically deny the existence of other gods. It is satisfied with simply proscribing their worship. It does not go beyond the level of the first commandment. Like it is not advocating monotheism but monolatry. Loisy as well supports this hypothesis and even sees in monolatry a retreat with regard to polytheism, a retreat connected to the hypertrophy of a feeling of national pride and religious fanaticism. The legislation from Mount Sinai does not clearly appear to be intended for all peoples, it remains only the charter of the covenant contracted between Yahweh and his people. Yahweh himself does not deny the existence of other gods but is content to speak ill of them. How, in any case, could one be jealous of something that does not exist? Wouldn't his jealousy be the very proof of the existence of other gods? Deuteronomy proclaims, "Yahweh your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords," 10:17. Similar formulations can be found in later parts of the Bible. "Our God is greater than all the gods," 2 Chronicles 2:4. "Yahweh is a God of greatness, a king who surpasses all the gods," Psalms 94:3. "Yahweh is more dreadful than all the gods," Psalms 95:4. "He is the most high among all the gods," Psalms 96:9. "He will destroy all the gods of the land," Zephaniah 2:11, and so forth. More than a true monotheism at the time of Moses, it would be more appropriate to speak of a monolatry or a henotheism, meaning a system in which one believes that only the God one invokes is all-powerful. It is in the second Isaiah or the Deutero-Isaiah, 40-55, that Judeo-Christian monotheism reaches completion. "Only Yahweh is God, before me, no God was formed, and after me there will be no other. I am I, Yahweh, and there is no Savior but me," 43:10-11. "There is no other but me, I am Yahweh, there is no other," 45-6. "The other deities are but pure nothingness, you are less than nothing and your works are less than nothing, and to choose you is an abomination," 41:24. "Here altogether they are nothing, their works are nothing, their statues are wind and emptiness." 41:29. Yahweh is the unique God, rather than the one God, the one is a finite form and Yahweh can only be infinite. The process has not attained completion, and perhaps this total affirmation on its own was enough to guide the writers of the Bible to retrospectively remake their history in the direction of the unique. This history, writes Jean-Louis Tristany, in fact conforms too closely with the needs of a monotheistic era to be honest. Whether it is Abraham's exodus from Ur in Chaldea or the exodus of the Jewish slaves under Moses' leadership, these tales are woven with the thread of one ingenuous monotheistic darkness, one sole father of the human race, Adam, monogenicism, then Noah, one lone father of the Hebrew people, Abraham, one sole legislator, Moses, one sole God, Yahweh. After the death of Ezra, Judea was subjected to a century of Persian domination. We then see a certain evolution of the Hebraic religion under the influence of Zoroastrian dualism and a multitude of new deities. The Bible's dualism was clearly heightened by this. On the one hand, it was the time in which the problem of evil was posed with the greatest acuteness. The Book of Job, which was probably set down in writing between 300 and 250 BC, attempted to deal with this problem. On the other hand, the idea that demons and evil spirits existed was spreading. Hebraic angelology and demonology took on more precise form. These themes can be found in the pre-rabbinic literature, then later in the Aggadah. In the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Bible, the words God and Satyr are rendered as Chadim, demons. In the Pirkei Avot, a morality treatise incorporated into the Mishnah, among the 10 objects created on the eve of the first Sabbath, there is mention of the Mazikin, maleficent spirits. The dualistic tendency will be increased significantly in Christianity, which, on the other hand, will maintain a piety that remains relatively rooted in local forms of worship. Yahweh's unique nature excludes any comparison, any competition, at the same time that it attracts every aspect of human life by means of tropisms. Recognition of this unique nature is to acknowledge that nothing can be compared to or incorporated into Yahweh, and because of that no worship can be offered to any other. From its onset, Judeo-Christianity has established itself as mythless religion, in other words as a religion shorn of what had until that time always characterized religion. Hence, perhaps the accusation of atheism the Romans lodged against the Jews: myths reflect the world, they make the world sacred. Now the world, according to the Bible, must be made non-sacred. Nature should no longer be animated on earth, the gods should cease dwelling there and providing man a transfigured image of himself. What is most opposed to Judeo-Christian monotheism is veiled cosmic religiosity, the hidden religiosity of the universe. This is why the Bible condemns natural magic so vigorously. This is the magic that Odin, as we have already seen, used in the final stages of the foundational war, the magic whose resurgence Judeo-Christianity would ceaselessly denounce, right up through the period of the witch trials, as so many diabolical manifestations. Judaism did not elevate the idols to a sublime state, writes Emmanuel Levinas, it demanded their destruction, it disenchanted the world. The transition from mythos, the myth that has no need to know itself as myth, to logos, notes Jean-Pierre Serrano, already constitutes a primary degradation of myth to the extent it includes its rationalization as well as its historicization. This is when myth is lived as fiction, a beautiful story no doubt, but false history nonetheless. It is no longer a way of knowing, but an object of knowledge. This sets off a process of desacralizing and disenchanting the world, an Ensoberung which in the space of a few centuries, following the secularization of religious ideologies, fueled a pure rationalism, a conception of the world as pure object, pure machine, pure matter lacking gods and soul, which self-elected researchers gradually put to death with analyses that were so many reductions and examples of disassociation. For the process of Ensoberung was not halted mid-route. In this regard, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, far from constituting the antithesis of biblical monotheism, represents rather its profane transposition and ineluctable culmination. As noted by Theodore W. Adorno, an entire part, the most voluminous one, of the social sciences has followed the European Aufklärung down the same path. And now it is the turn of modern theologians, deliberately breaking with the Christian miracles of the Middle Ages, miracles inspired in large part by paganism, to provide their own entothethologizierung, this demythologization which Jean Brun described as merely literal fetishes that claim to prompt the pure spirit to spring from the text. The rigid nature of biblical law is in fact the direct effect of an intentional rupture with that world-born religiosity specific to paganism. The relationship to the world has not been emptied of meaning but transformed by means of an immutable ritual, allowing the conciliation of life on earth with the refusal of the seductions of mythology. The Hebrews, note Adorno and Horkheimer, did not eliminate adaptation to nature, but converted it into a series of duties in the form of ritual. They have retained the aspect of expiation, but have avoided the reversion to mythology which symbolism implies. The site of the sin has been thereby conserved, but the sin itself has been eliminated. In parallel fashion, the scribes of the Bible were led little by like to formulate their doctrine of sacrifice. An important evolution can also be seen here. The Bible stages countless sacrifices. But there can be no question of viewing these the way the ancients viewed sacrifice, an essentially joyful occasion of offering to the gods objects, which being retired from the profane domain for this occasion, had become sacred objects. During the 1st century AD, Sallustius wrote, "The happiness of every being is its own perfection and perfection for each is union with its own cause. For this reason we pray for union with the gods, and that is why men sacrifice." In the Bible sacrifice most often smacks of atonement. There is the sacrifice for sin, audit, or the sacrifice of reparation, asa. After the destruction of the temple, expiatory sacrifices would be eliminated and replaced by repentance and return for pardon. Furthermore, Yahweh obviously does not take part in sacrifices. It is inconceivable that he would seat himself, even symbolically, at the tables of mortals, as did the pagan gods who visited altars and in whose honor knife and fork were lifted. Also, the idea was gradually put forth that Yahweh despised natural feats and ceremonies. He was horrified by cosmic religiosity because it carries with it the idea that life never dies, that it renews ceaselessly, that history itself can regenerate, that there is an eternal dialectical solidarity between life and death, beginning and end, man and gods. Yahweh prefers the exaltation of abstract universal notions like peace, justice, and law over the sacrifice of things. Criticism of sacrifices is developed specifically by the prophets who confronted pagan reality directly. "What concern to me are your sacrifices, saith the Lord. I am disgusted by your burnt offerings of rams and fatted calves." Isaiah 1:11. "It is love that pleases me and not sacrifices, knowledge of God rather than holocausts." Hosea 6:6. "I hate and despise your feasts and feel not for your solemn gathering. When you make burnt offerings and oblations to me, they do not please me. I look not at the sacrifice of your fatted animals. Go from my presence with the noise of your canticles, so that I do not hear the music of your harps." Amos 5:1-23. For this reason the worship of the unique God embodied by Yahweh brings about the negation of the worship that humans would be tempted to render unto themselves for their own gods. All the prophets fulminated with vigor and even extraordinary rage against the pagan cults. In every form of the world's religiosity they denounced idolatry. There are no words strong enough to stigmatize the impurity of foreign mores, and especially the kind of mixed marriage on the religious plane, syncretism. Just as the covenant between Yahweh and his people emerged from the symbolism of marriage, religious infidelity and compromises with exterior forms of belief are incessantly likened to adultery and prostitution. By honoring other gods, we read in Exodus, the foreign peoples prostitute themselves, 34:15. You have profaned the land by your prostitutions and misdeeds, screams Jeremiah, 3-2. Jerusalem itself, the faithful city, becomes a harlot according to Isaiah, 1:21. The formulation reoccurs with Hosea as a metaphor about the sons of prostitution, 2-6, as well as in Ezekiel. This vocabulary is not employed by chance. If we adopt the arrangement suggested by Rachi that consists of placing the 10 commandments in 5 opposing pairs, it will be noted that the first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," is paired with the 6th, "You shall not commit adultery." The object of the ritual prescriptions in the Pentateuch, in their great number and great detail, is to keep Yahweh's faithful protected from Canaanite influences, to establish a discrimination, a separation between them and the pagans. Just as the religion must not be contaminated by surrounding cults, those who gather in its name should avoid outside contamination. The enclosing within the law results from this preoccupation. According to the words of Blandine Barrett-Kriegel, the Hebrew people only attain their identity through submitting to the yoke of the law. This also, in the same stroke, checks assimilation, prevents what would later be called chukat bagoy, imitation of the Gentiles, goyim. The Bible displays a particular horror of mixtures. To be holy is to be separate, the mixture is impure, see Nehemiah 13:30. It is forbidden to yoke together beasts of different species, to mix seeds at the time of sowing, to weave wool and linen blends, to switch the garb of men and women. Many of the food prohibitions seem to obey the same preoccupation. It is about respecting what Yahweh has separated. Above all, it is about man not combining and surpassing related contraries, not attributing to himself the powers of surpassing and unifying that belong solely to Yahweh. For this reason all hybrids are condemned. Also mixed marriages are most vigorously condemned. These are subject to legal action by what Leon Polyakov calls the rigorous directives decreed by the law of Moses against hybridization or crossbreeding. In fact, mixed marriage also represents a compromise and a synergy, and for this reason is adulterous, or in any case an adulteration, meaning an act of prostitution. In Genesis it is in response to the transgression of such a prohibition, the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men, 6:1-4, that Yahweh repents his decision to create humanity and decides to drown them with the deluge. This law will be twisted on numerous occasions, and these infringements are not of a lesser nature. Moses, immigrant in foreign lands, weds the daughter of a priest of Midian. David is descended from Ruth, a Moabite, but it will nonetheless be constantly reasserted. The prophets appointed themselves its most ruthless defenders. Malachi sees the source of Yahweh's wrath in the abomination of mixed marriages, 2:10-12. During the reforms of Ezra, mixed marriage became practically a crime, a betrayal of Yahweh, and the names of the guilty were made public, Ezra 10:18-44, and their unions dissolved, Ezra 9:1-12. The first part of the historical books of the Bible ends on this description by Nehemiah of these sorry combinations. Even in these days, I see Jews who have wed Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite women. As for their children, half speak Ashdodine or the language of this or that people, but no longer know how to speak Hebrew. I rebuked them and called down curses upon them. I struck several and pulled their hair, and made them swear an oath by God, "You should not give your daughters to their sons, nor take for wives any of their daughters, for your sons or yourselves." Was this not the sin of Solomon, king of Israel? Am I to understand that you too will commit this great crime, betray your God by marrying foreign women? 13:23-27. For this reason the struggle against idolatry forms one of the core points of biblical thought. From the Pentateuch to the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, it may represent the most often repeated theme. Idolatry is the very source of all evil and ill morally indefensible behavior. This is why the tradition places its interdiction as high, seeming even higher at times, than the worship devoted to Yahweh himself. So just what is idolatry? It is the fact of rendering unto someone else, man or God, the worship that should be exclusively given to Yahweh. In other words, it is taking for an absolute what the Bible declares is only relative, or vice versa, which amounts to saying that the preeminent form of idolatry for man consists of declaring himself the sole bestower of meaning, free to construct himself, autonomous with respect to everything that is other than him. Hence the incessant denunciations of human vanities, the anathema against human pride, and the appeals for humility that Christianity will propagate. Man should occupy the whole of his place, but nothing but his place. He is forbidden to go beyond himself. Under these conditions, idolatry is everywhere, the idols are legion. When Paul entered Athens to attempt to sway the people from his own ancestral convictions, he described the city as filled with idols, Acts 17:16. Among these idols there were statues of the gods, 17:29, but also of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, 17:18. This did not prevent Paul from declaring, Athenians, in all respects you are, as I can see, the most religious of men, 17:22. What is most remarkable about the biblical conception of idolatry is that it is expressly forbidden even to those who do not believe in Yahweh's existence. In fact, the prohibition of idolatry figures highly among the 7 Noachitic precepts that are allegedly valid for all humanity. Going to the opposite extreme, tradition also maintains that Yahweh cannot be truly worshipped on Yule. Every trace of idolatry has been eliminated. For he who refuses idolatry, says the Talmud, it is as if he fulfilled the entire Torah. So it is clearly idolatry, not atheism, that is condemned. For the biblical mentality, it is better to claim that God does not exist than to worship a false god. Yahweh is more ruthless against those who excite his jealousy than those who deny his existence. A complete negative theology has developed out of this idea, according to which the observance of the no prevails in certain respects over that of yes. This theology is a generalized rendering to the attitude of the Noachides. For one of respecting the positive principles, at least one should heed the negative commandments. In the extreme case, it is even maintained that the first were created in order to ensure that observance of the latter was respected. Most significantly, certain neo-Marxist authors have borrowed the same idea, from the perspective of a strict transfer of biblical values to this plane. Mankind, for its salvation, does not need to worship God, writes Erich Fromm. All it needs is not to blaspheme and not to worship idols. A similar opinion can be found in the writings of Ernst Bloch and some of the more recent adepts of a Judeo-Christianity without God. When idolatry finally disappears, something that will not please the gods, Yahweh's declaration will in fact become superfluous. The objective will have been attained. Humanity will live without God but in accordance with the principles of Yahweh. By all evidence, this is the contemporary meaning of the fight against idolatry. Afflict man with a critical incapability and impotence when confronted by the diffusion of biblical values, neutralize those who cannot be won over, transform them into objective allies. The ban on idolatry is nothing other than an incapacitating mayeth. One of the designations for the Sinai is Horeb, a word whose root elicits the idea of destruction, of paganism. In fact, it seems that any and all means are good when it involves the destruction of idolatry. You shall abolish all the places where the people you dispossess will have served their gods, on the mountaintops, the hills and under every green tree. You shall demolish their altars, break their steles, their sacred devotions you shall burn, the graven images of their gods you shall strike down, and you shall erase their name from this place. Deuteronomy 12:2-3. During this ancient time, the fight against idolatry authorized murder, if your brother, son of your father or son of your mother, your son, your daughter, the wife who rests on your breast or the companion likened unto yourself, secretly seek to seduce you by saying, Come, let us serve other gods, that you and your fathers did not know. Yes, you should kill him, your hand should be the first against him to put him to death, and the hand of all the people will continue the execution. Deuteronomy 13:7-10. If an entree city remains faithful to its gods, then mass slaughter becomes a pious duty. If it be clearly proven and well established that such an abomination has been committed in your midst, you must put the inhabitants of this city to the sword, you should condemn it to execration, it and all it contains, it will become forever a ruin, never to be rebuilt. Deuteronomy 13:15-17. For this reason Yahweh ordered the extermination of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Deuteronomy 20:17. Christianity, as we know, zealously continued to pursue this program against a perpetually renewing European paganism, because the people turned Christian can always surrender to the pagan temptations they carry inside, as Monsignor Jean-Marie Lustiger wrote with quite unintentional humor. Why this rabid behavior? Because of Yahweh's jealousy? No doubt. But this jealousy is itself only a sign. As said earlier, Yahweh is not simply unique because he is alone. It is also because he is radically otber. A pagan who worshipped only a single idol would nevertheless remain an idolater. In fact, Yahweh does not forgive idols for being intermediaries between man and the world, for abolishing the distance between man and the being of the world, or, at the very least, for proclaiming that the distance is not unbridgeable. The bond Yahweh seeks to break is the bond that unites man to God within a being in which both are beings, a bond by which man may rise out of who he is, in complete freedom, toward what is more than he is. Certainly condemnation of idolatry can appear justified in an era when man is overly prone to considering as absolutes things that are not worthwhile. But it is not because they are taken as absolutes that these things should be condemned. The primary reason, rather, is that they are not worthwhile. I would be the first to condemn an idolatry that diminishes a person, by which he deconstructs and unmakes himself. But I exalt, on the other hand, the idolatry, by which I mean the real faith, that enables a person to grow, with which he elevates himself above his present condition by establishing himself fully as the measure of all things. In worshipping the idol, man worships himself, says Erich Fromm. The phrase is correct but not devoid of a certain ambiguity. Let's say in more simple terms that by honoring his gods, man honors his ability to live in symbiosis with them, that he honors his own capacity, by means of a free will to power, to become equal to the models he has chosen.